Welcome to Café Tales. I am Alie, your host for today's mystery. We're joining the legendary Hercule Poirot today in wartime Lisbon, 1941, with Goodnight. Mr. Coffin, before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of tea, keep your wits about you, and let's unravel this dangerous web of espionage and murder together. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Journey. Goodnight. Mr. Coffin. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Journey. The October sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Lisbon as our taxi wound its way through streets that seemed to hum with a peculiar energy. I had grown accustomed over the years to Poirot's sudden whims and mysterious summons, but this particular journey to Portugal had come as something of a shock. One moment, we were settling into our usual autumn routine in London. The next, we were boarding a flight to what the newspapers called Europe's last refuge. "I say, Poirot," I ventured, adjusting my collar against the unfamiliar warmth. "You've been remarkably quiet about this telegram from the consulate. Surely you can tell me something about why we've been dragged all this way." My friend sat beside me, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he observed the passing scene with those sharp green eyes of his. His moustaches, immaculate as ever, despite the journey, twitched slightly, a sign I had learned to recognize as deep concentration. "Patience, mon ami," he replied, straightening an imaginary crease in his perfectly pressed suit. "All will become clear in due course. For now, observe Lisbon. She is like a great stage, n'est-ce pas? And upon this stage, players from every corner of Europe perform their little dramas. Indeed, even from our brief taxi ride, the city's unique character was unmistakable. Refugees in shabby coats hurried past elegant cafes where well-dressed diplomats sipped their coffee. German and British accents mingled with Portuguese and Spanish in the babel of voices that drifted through our open window. Motorcars bearing diplomatic plates jostled for space with donkey carts, while uniformed officials of various nations checked papers at seemingly every corner. Our destination, the Hotel Tivoli, proved to be a magnificent establishment that would not have looked out of place in any European capital. Its cream-colored facade rose 5 stories above the Avenida Liberdade, with ornate balconies overlooking the broad avenue. As we climbed the stone steps to the entrance, I noticed that the usual array of international newspapers displayed in the lobby bore headlines in half a dozen languages, though curiously, many had been cut or torn, leaving gaps where articles should have been. "Bomb dire. Dear gentlemen, you must be Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings." The voice belonged to a compact olive-skinned man in an impeccable hotel uniform. His English carried only the slightest Portuguese accent. "I am Captain Rodriguez, the manager. Your rooms have been prepared as requested by your consulate." As Rodriguez led us across the marble-floored lobby, I could not help but notice the extraordinary mix of guests. Near the ornate fireplace, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and a monocle read what appeared to be a German newspaper, his movements precise and methodical. At a small table by the window, a striking woman with raven black hair and crimson lips nursed a coffee while watching the street with intense dark eyes. Her dress was elegant, but not ostentatious, the sort worn by someone accustomed to moving in society, but currently traveling light. "Quite the international gathering," I murmured to Poirot, as we followed Rodriguez toward the lift. "Indeed," he replied quietly, "and notice, Hastings, how everyone watches everyone else. The lady by the window, she has glanced at every person who has entered or left the lobby in the past 5 minutes. The gentleman with the newspaper, see how he holds it. One does not read a newspaper with such alertness." The lift operator, thin young woman with prematurely grey hair and intelligent blue eyes, operated the mechanism with quiet efficiency. She wore a simple hotel uniform, but there was something about her bearing that suggested education and breeding well above her station. When Rodriguez addressed her as Miss Hartwell, she responded in crisp upper-class English that seemed oddly at variance with her position. "Third floor, for our distinguished guests, the Wellington and Marlborough suites." "Certainly, Captain Rodriguez," she replied, her gaze meeting mine briefly before returning to the controls. There was something oddly watchful in those blue eyes. Our suites proved comfortable and well appointed, with tall windows overlooking the avenue. As Rodriguez departed with assurances that anything we required would be promptly provided, I found myself drawn to the balcony. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, and the street below had taken on the golden quality peculiar to southern European cities. "Poirot," I said, returning to find him methodically unpacking his small case. "There's something rather odd about this place. I can't quite put my finger on it, but everyone seems to be acting." "Precisement, Hastings," he said, carefully, placing his clothes brush on the dressing table and adjusting its position twice to achieve perfect alignment. "In Lisbon, in these times, no one is quite what they appear to be. The businessman may be a diplomat, the diplomat may be a spy, and the spy," he paused, smoothing his mustache thoughtfully, "the spy may be something else entirely." Through the thin walls, I could hear the murmur of voices from the adjacent room, a man's voice speaking in accented English, seeming agitated about something. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried clearly, urgent, perhaps even frightened. "I say," I whispered, "shouldn't we—" But Poirot held up a restraining hand, his head cocked to listen. After a moment, the voices ceased, and we heard a door close with perhaps more force than necessary. "Most interesting," Poirot murmured, moving to arrange his silver-backed brushes in precise parallel lines. "It appears, mon ami, that the Hotel Tivoli provides its guests with more than comfortable accommodations. It offers them drama, mystery, and, if I'm not mistaken, danger." As if to punctuate his words, somewhere in the hotel, a telephone rang insistently, was answered, and then silence fell once more. But it was a charged silence, heavy with unspoken tensions and hidden purposes. I found myself wondering what exactly that cryptic telegram had said and why the British consulate had felt it necessary to summon Hercule Poirot to this crossroads of wartime Europe. The sun had nearly set now, painting the hotel corridor in deep shadows as we prepared for dinner. Whatever had brought us to Lisbon, I suspected we would not have long to wait before discovering the true nature of our mission. Chapter 2. The last good night. The morning brought with it the sort of crisp October air that made one grateful to be alive, though, as events would prove, not everyone at the Hotel Tivoli had been equally fortunate. I had risen early, as was my habit, and was enjoying a solitary breakfast in the dining room when the commotion began. It started as a murmur from the Portuguese staff, their rapid conversation punctuated by gestures toward the upper floors. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the dining room doorway, his usually composed features drawn with concern. He approached my table with measured steps, though I detected a certain urgency beneath his professional manner. "Captain Hastings," he said, lowering his voice, "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Monsieur Poirot. There has been an incident." I found Poirot in his suite, already impeccably dressed despite the early hour, examining what appeared to be a hotel floor plan with the same intensity he might bring to a crossword puzzle. He looked up as I entered, and I could see from his expression that he had already sensed something amiss. "Ah, Hastings, I take it Captain Rodriguez has spoken with you about our fellow guest." "Fellow guest," I repeated, though even as I said it, I recalled the agitated voices we had heard through the walls the previous evening. "Mr. Jonathan Coffin," Rodriguez explained as he joined us, "the British journalist in the room next to yours. I am afraid he has passed away during the night." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed, and the circumstances, natural causes, it would appear," Rodriguez replied, though his tone carried a note of uncertainty. "The poor gentleman seems to have died peacefully in his sleep, but the British consulate has requested that, given the delicate nature of the times, any death of a British subject should be examined with particular care." "Natural, Poirot murmured, reaching for his hat. "We shall, of course, be happy to assist." Room 347 lay just beyond our suite, separated by what I now realized were disappointingly thin walls. Rodriguez produced a passkey, and we entered to find a scene of apparent tranquility. The room was knit almost fastidiously with personal effects arranged with military precision. Jonathan Coffin lay in the narrow hotel bed, his face peaceful, hands folded across his chest, as if he had simply drifted off to sleep. He appeared to have been a man of perhaps 45 years, with thinning brown hair and the sort of pale complexion one associated with indoor work. His clothes hung neatly in the wardrobe, and a leather satchel sat precisely aligned with the edge of the writing desk. "Who discovered the body?" Poirot inquired, moving slowly around the room with that peculiar shuffling gait of his. "Miguel Santos, one of our porters," Rodriguez replied. "Senor Coffin had requested breakfast to be brought to his room this morning. When Miguel knocked and received no answer, He used his key. The gentleman appeared to be sleeping, but Miguel, he is observant, he noticed. Poirot had paused by the bedside table, where a small glass sat beside a water carafe. "Tell me," he said, "what were Mr. Coffin's last words to the staff?" Rodriguez consulted a small notebook. "Miguel spoke with him around 10 last evening. The gentleman said, and, I quote, 'No calls, no visitors, just good night.'" Miguel thought it an odd way to phrase it, but then, the English praised off diplomatically. I moved closer to examine the deceased, but found little of obvious interest. Coffin's expression was serene, almost satisfied. There were no visible signs of struggle or distress. Yet I noticed that Poirot had taken his magnifying glass from his pocket, and was studying the nightstand with minute attention. "What sort of journalist was he?" I asked Rodriguez. "I mean, what was his particular area of interest?" "Political affairs, I believe. He often sat in the lobby reading various newspapers, quite a pile of them, always doing those crossword puzzles. Too, said it kept his mind sharp for his work." Poirot had moved to the writing desk, where several newspapers lay scattered. Among them, I noticed, was a crossword puzzle book that appeared to have been dropped or thrown, its pages slightly crumpled. Near the window, fragments of what looked like a telegram lay on the carpet, as if someone had torn it hastily and dropped the pieces. "Most curious," Poirot murmured, bending to examine the torn paper. "Tell me, Captain Rodriguez, was Mr. Coffin in the habit of receiving telegrams?" "Not that I am aware of," though Rodriguez paused, frowning. "Yesterday afternoon, Miss Hartwell did mention that a telegram had arrived for him. She handles much of our correspondence, you understand." I watched as Poirot carefully gathered the fragments of paper, placing them in a small envelope from his pocket. He then returned to the bedside table and, producing a small silver spoon from his waistcoat, took a tiny sample from the glass that had contained what was presumably Coffin's nighttime drink. "You suspect something irregular?" I ventured. "Observe, mon ami," Poirot replied, holding the glass to the light. "The sediment at the bottom, see how it is settled. And regard the crossword book, thrown down in haste. Perhaps the telegram, torn and scattered. These details, they speak to Poirot of agitation, of urgency, not the actions of a man preparing peacefully for sleep." Rodriguez looked increasingly uncomfortable. "But surely, Monsieur Poirot, if there had been foul play, there would be signs." "The door was locked from the inside. Miguel had to use his passkey. The window is too high for anyone to have entered from outside." "Ah, yes, the locked room," Poirot said softly, running his finger along the windowsill. "But there are other ways to commit murder than by entering a room. Nest ce poison, for instance, requires only the opportunity to tamper with something the victim will consume." I felt a chill run down my spine as the implications became clear. "You think he was poisoned?" "I think Hastings, that a man who says just good night to a porter phrase, most curious and specific, and who tears up a telegram before retiring, was perhaps not planning to sleep as peacefully as appearances suggest." Through the window, I could see the morning bustle of Lisbon beginning in earnest. Diplomats and refugees, businessmen and pleasure-seekers, all going about their daily business in this strange, neutral haven. Yet here, in this quiet hotel room, it seemed that the war's dark undercurrents had found their way inside. Poirot had completed his piking examination and was carefully smoothing his moustaches, always a sign that his little grey cells were working with particular intensity. The peaceful scene before us had been transformed, in his capable hands, into something far more sinister. As we prepared to leave the room, I found myself wondering which of our fellow hotel guests might have wished Jonathan Coffin a more permanent good night than he had bargained for. Chapter 3. Shadows and secrets. The morning sun had given way to grey clouds by the time Poirot announced his intention to interview those hotel guests who had been acquainted with the late Jonathan Coffin. Captain Rodriguez had provided us with a list of residents who had spoken with the journalist during his week-long stay, and it was, as Poirot observed, a most international gathering. "We shall begin," he declared, settling himself in the hotel's small reading room, with the order of proximity those closest to Monsieur Coffin's room, "and then we shall work our way outward, like ripples in a pond." Our first interview was with Miss Dorothy Hartwell, the lift operator we had encountered the previous evening. In the daylight, her prematurely grey hair and intelligent blue eyes seemed even more incongruous with her humble position. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap with a precision that would have done credit to a finishing school. I understand you handled correspondence for the hotel guests, Poirot began gently. Perhaps you could tell us about Mr. Coffin's habits regarding mail and telegrams. Mr. Coffin was most particular about his correspondence, she replied in her crisp accent. He received several telegrams during his stay, though yesterday's was ... unusual. In what way unusual, mademoiselle? Miss Hartwell's fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly. Well, it was marked urgent, but when I delivered it to his room around 4 o'clock, he seemed more distressed than pleased. He asked several questions about who had delivered it and whether anyone had seen it arrive, and had anyone, not that I observed, though she paused, glancing toward the window where rain had begun to spatter the glass. Signora Vasquez was in the lobby when it arrived. She's quite observant about the comings and goings of other guests. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Signora Vasquez, Elena Vasquez, the Spanish lady. She performs at one of the nightclubs in the Barrio Alto. Quite striking, as I'm sure you noticed. Indeed, we had noticed the raven-haired woman from the previous evening, and when she joined us 20 minutes later, her presence seemed to fill the small reading room. Elena Vasquez was perhaps 30, with dark eyes that held a mixture of weariness and defiance. Her English was excellent, though touched with a melodious Spanish accent. "Poor Senor Coffin," she said, settling gracefully into her chair. "Such a quiet man, but there was something, how do you say, troubled about him these past few days." "You spoke with him recently?" Poirot inquired. "But of course, we are all exiles here, in our way the English, the Germans, the Spanish. We find ourselves thrown together by circumstances beyond our control." Her hands moved expressively as she spoke. Senor Coffin, he would sit in the lobby each evening reading his newspapers and working those puzzles. Sometimes we would speak of the war, of home, and what was his mood yesterday evening. Elena's expression grew thoughtful, nervous, I think. He kept looking toward the entrance as if expecting someone. When I asked if he was well, he said something strange, that he hoped tomorrow would bring better news than today had. I found myself studying her carefully. There was something rehearsed about her responses, as if she had prepared for these questions. Yet when she spoke of Coffin's nervousness, I detected what seemed to be genuine concern. "Tell me, Signora," Poirot continued, "did you observe anything unusual about the hotel last evening? Any visitors, perhaps, or conversations of note?" The German gentleman, Senor Weberhe, seemed agitated, more so than usual. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. He paced the lobby for nearly an hour after dinner, checking his watch constantly, and he made several telephone calls from the booth near the reception desk. Friedrich Weber, when summoned, proved to be the distinguished gentleman with the monocle we had observed, reading German newspapers. He was perhaps 55, with silver hair meticulously combed, and a bearing that suggested military training. His English was precise but heavily accented. "I knew Herr Coffin only slightly," he stated, adjusting his monocle with mechanical precision. "We occasionally shared a table at breakfast, a pleasant enough fellow, though I found his questions rather probing." "Questions?" Poirot leaned forward slightly. "About my business in Lisbon, my travel plans, the sort of inquiries one might expect from a journalist, I suppose, but they seemed overly personal for casual conversation." Weber's jaw tightened. "Yesterday he asked specifically about my contacts in America, my plans for departure, most inappropriate given our brief acquaintance." "And your response, monsieur?" "I told him that my business affairs were confidential." The man seemed to take everything as potential material for his articles. Weber removed his monocle and polished it with methodical strokes. "I must say, I found his persistence rather trying." I noticed that Weber's hands, despite their steady movements, betrayed a slight tremor. Moreover, his story of Coffin's nosiness seemed almost too convenient, the sort of thing one might say to explain why a victim had been asking uncomfortable questions. Captain Rodriguez proved the most forthcoming of our interviews, though I suspected his openness was carefully calculated. He joined us in his office, a cramped space behind the reception desk that afforded views of both the lobby and the street beyond. Senor Coffin was a model guest. He began, settling behind his desk with a weary sigh. Quiet, punctual, no complaints. He paid his bills promptly and made no demands on the staff. Yet yesterday he seemed ... troubled. Poirot suggested. He came to the desk around 6 o'clock, asking about security measures for the hotel, whether we locked the building at night, how many staff members had passkeys, that sort of thing. When I asked if he felt unsafe, he said only that a man in his profession learned to be cautious, his profession being journalism, so he claimed. Rodriguez's tone carried a note of skepticism. Though I have known many journalists, Monsieur Poirot, and few of them were quite so systematic in their habits. Senor Coffin kept regular hours, maintained detailed notes, and seemed to know a great deal about political affairs that never appeared in any articles. This was intriguing. I watched as Poirot made a small note in his leather pocketbook. You suspect he was not what he seemed. In Lisbon, in these times, very few people are exactly what they seem. Rodriguez replied diplomatically. We ask no questions that are not essential to hotel management. But yes, I had begun to wonder about Senor Coffin's true business here. As we concluded our interviews and retired to Poirot's suite, I found my head spinning with contradictory impressions. Each of our subjects had painted a slightly different picture of Jonathan Coffin's final day, and each seemed to harbor secrets of their own. Well, Poirot, I said, settling into a chair by the window, what do you make of it all? Weber seems, the obvious suspect, clearly agitated, asking uncomfortable questions, though I must say, Elena Vasquez struck me as rather too helpful with her observations. Poirot was standing before the mirror, carefully adjusting his tie with the sort of attention he usually reserved for the most crucial evidence. In the glass, I could see his green eyes holding that peculiar intensity that meant his little grey cells were working at full capacity. Each tells a part of the truth, mon ami, but none tells it all. And in their very evasions, they reveal perhaps more than they intend. He turned from the mirror and moved to the window, gazing down at the street where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. But there is something else, something that troubles Poirot more than their individual deceptions. What's that? They all seem to know more about Jonathan Coffin than they are willing to admit, and that suggests, mon ami, that our quiet journalist was indeed something other than what he appeared to be. Chapter 4. The Puzzle Master. The afternoon had grown quiet in the Hotel Tivoli, that peculiar hush that settles over establishments where tragedy has recently occurred. Poirot had spread the contents of Jonathan Coffin's satchel across the small table in our suite, arranging each item with his characteristic precision. Among the papers, notebooks, and personal effects, the crossword puzzle books held his particular attention. Regard, Hastings, he said, opening one of the slim volumes. Here we have the hobby of a methodical mind, but see how certain letters have been marked ever so lightly with pencil. I leaned over his shoulder to examine the pages. Indeed, scattered throughout the completed puzzles were tiny marked dots, small lines, almost invisible, unless one looked closely. At first glance, they appeared to be casual notations, perhaps marking particularly difficult clues. Surely those are just, I began, but Poirot held up a restraining hand. Nan, mon ami, these marks, they follow a pattern. Here, in yesterday's puzzle from the Diario de Noticias, see how every third marked letter, when taken in sequence, begins to form words. I watched as he carefully transcribed the marked letters onto a separate sheet of paper. Gradually, a message began to emerge. Operation Nightfall compromised. Stop departure imminent. Stop, good Lord. I breathed. He was using the crosswords to pass messages. Weitzman, and not just any messages, intelligence of the highest importance. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Our Monsieur Coffin, he was no simple journalist. He was, how do you say, in the business of secrets. A soft knock at the door interrupted our discovery. Miss Hartwell stood in the corridor, her usual composure notably absent. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a manila envelope to her chest. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Might I speak with you privately? There are ... Things I should have told you this morning. Poirot gestured her into the room with courtly politeness. She entered hesitantly, her eyes immediately falling upon the spread of papers on our table. When she saw the crossword puzzles with their tiny markings, her face went quite pale. You've discovered it then, she said, sinking into the offered chair. James always said the code was too simple, but it worked so well for so long. James, I interjected, but I thought his name was Jonathan Coffin. Miss Hartwell looked between us, her resolve clearly wavering. Finally, she opened the envelope she carried and withdrew a photograph. It showed our deceased hotel guest, but he was wearing a British military uniform with the insignia of a major. His real name was James Crawford, she said quietly. Major James Crawford, British intelligence. And I, she paused, straightening her shoulders with what appeared to be considerable effort. I am Dorothy Hartwell, Special Operations Executive. I was assigned to watch him. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. I found myself staring at this prim, grey-haired woman who had operated our lift with such unassuming efficiency, trying to reconcile her appearance with the world of espionage and secret operations. You were watching him, Poirot asked gently. For what purpose? James had been transmitting intelligence from Lisbon for over a year. Miss Hartwell explained, her professional training now asserting itself over her emotional distress. Information about German shipping movements, Spanish diplomatic activities, refugee patterns that might indicate enemy operations. The crossword code was his own innovation, simple but effective for routine communications. But something had changed. Poirot prompted. Miss Hartwell nodded grimly. 3 weeks ago, London began to suspect that our Lisbon network had been compromised. Too many operations were being anticipated. Too many of our contacts were disappearing. They sent me to determine whether James was the leak ... or whether he was in danger. And your conclusion? James was loyal, but he had become suspicious of everyone around him. Yesterday he received a telegram that convinced him his cover was blown. He was planning to leave Lisbon this morning on the early train to Madrid. I felt a chill of understanding, but someone made sure he never caught that train. Exactement, Poirot murmured. And this someone, they knew enough about his routines to poison his nightcap with what I suspect was digitalis, a poison that mimics heart failure in appropriate doses. Miss Hartwell's composure finally cracked. I should have protected him better. I knew he was frightened, but I thought we had more time to get him out safely. Tell me about his effects, Poirot said softly. Was anything missing from his room? His travel case, a small leather suitcase he always kept packed for emergencies. It contained his real identification papers, emergency funds, and a list of emergency contacts. When I checked his room this morning, after you left, it was gone, and his passport. Miss Hartwell reached into her envelope again and produced a British passport. This was in his jacket pocket, but it's not the one he was using here at the hotel. This belongs to someone named Timothy Walshan, either cover identity, I assume. His Jonathan Coffin papers have disappeared along with the suitcase. Poirot examined the passport with intense concentration. Most illuminating. So our murderer not only knew who James Crawford really was, but also knew enough about his methods to steal the correct identification documents. That suggests someone with intelligence training, I observed. Or someone working with such a person, Miss Hartwell added grimly. James suspected there was a double agent in our networks, someone selling information to multiple parties. It was trying to identify them when she trailed off. Unable to finish the sentence, Poirot rose and began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. So we have a British intelligence officer working under false identity, passing coded messages through crossword puzzles. He discovers his network is compromised and prepares to flee. But before he can escape, someone poisons him and steals his travel documents. The question is, I said, which of our suspects could have known his true identity? Captain Rodriguez manages the hotel and has access to all guest information, Miss Hartwell said thoughtfully. Senora Vasquez moves in circles that include diplomats and businessmen from all countries. She could easily be passing information. And Herr Weber, she paused significantly. James mentioned him specifically in his last report to London. Weber has been in Lisbon for 3 months, supposedly arranging passage to America. But his business contacts suggest connections to German intelligence. Poirot stopped his pacing and turned to face us both. Yet each of these suspects, they could have legitimate reasons for being in Lisbon that have nothing to do with espionage. The war, it makes refugees and opportunists of us all. Through the window, the late afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the hotel courtyard. Somewhere in the building, a telephone rang, a sound that now seemed ominous rather than routine. Miss Hartwell gathered her papers with nervous efficiency, clearly preparing to leave. There's something else, she said as she reached the door. James's final crossword, the one from yesterday's evening edition. I've been trying to decode it, but the message is incomplete. Either he was interrupted while encoding it, or she handed Poirot a folded newspaper, or the message was meant to identify his killer. As the door closed behind her, I found myself staring at Poirot with a mixture of admiration and concern. We had uncovered the victim's true identity, and purpose, but in doing so, we had also revealed the deadly stakes involved. Someone in this quiet hotel was playing a game far more dangerous than crossword puzzles. The shadows in our room seemed to deepen as Poirot carefully unfolded the newspaper, his expression grave with the knowledge that we were no longer investigating a simple murder, but a case that could have implications reaching far beyond the walls of the Hotel Tivoli. Chapter 5. The Nightclub Confession. The Fardu Athul occupied a narrow building tucked into one of the winding streets of the Barrio Alto, its blue-painted facade barely visible in the evening gloom. Poirot had suggested we observe Alina Vasquez in her professional environment, reasoning that people often revealed their true selves when performing the roles they had chosen rather than those circumstances had forced upon them. The interior was intimate, perhaps seating no more than 40 guests at small tables arranged around a tiny stage. Smoke from countless cigarettes created a hazy atmosphere that seemed to muffle both sound and sight, lending the room an air of conspiracy. As we settled at a corner table with a clear view of both the stage and the entrance, I noticed that the clientele was as international as that of our hotel. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured, nodding toward a table near the stage where Friedrich Weber sat alone, nursing what appeared to be his third brandy. "Our German friend seems to have developed a taste for Portuguese fado. Perhaps it is the singer who draws him here." Indeed, Weber's attention was fixed upon the stage with an intensity that seemed to go beyond mere appreciation of the music. When Alina appeared in a flowing black dress that emphasized her dramatic coloring, his posture straightened noticeably. Elena's voice was rich and melancholy, perfectly suited to the haunting traditional songs that spoke of loss, longing, and the sorrows of the sea. Yet I found myself watching the audience as much as the performer. Captain Rodriguez sat at a table by the back wall, positioned where he could observe the entire room. Miss Hartwell had declined to join us, claiming fatigue, but I suspected she was conducting her own investigations elsewhere. During the interval, Alina moved among the tables with practiced grace, speaking briefly with various patrons. When she reached Weber's table, their conversation appeared cordial enough, though I noticed that her smile seemed forced and her hands trembled slightly as she accepted his offered cigarette. "She is frightened," Poirot observed quietly. "But of what or whom?" The answer came sooner than expected. As Alina returned to the stage for her second set, Weber rose abruptly and made his way toward the exit, his movements careful but urgent-like, those of a man trying not to appear to be fleeing. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly, and he signaled for the bill. We followed Weber at a discreet distance, though it soon became apparent that he was indeed returning to the Hotel Tivoli. By the time we reached the lobby, he was already in the lift with Miss Hartwell. Through the ornate metal grillwork, I could see them engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, as we waited for the lift to descend. "It seems our suspects are less isolated from one another than they would have us believe." When we reached our floor, Weber's room was silent, but a thin line of light showed beneath his door. Poirot paused in the corridor, his head tilted in that characteristic listening pose. From within, we could hear the sounds of rapid movement, drawers opening and closing, papers rustling, the snap of a suitcase lock. "Hastings," Poirot whispered, "I believe our Herr Weber is preparing for a journey." We had barely settled in our own suite when Captain Rodriguez appeared at our door, his usually composed demeanor notably agitated. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, stepping inside without invitation, "I must speak with you urgently. Senor Weber has requested immediate transportation to the railway station. He claims a family emergency." But Rodriguez paused, running his hand through his hair. "There are things about this hotel, about my guests, that I should have told you earlier." "And what things are these?" Rodriguez moved to the window, peering down at the street below, as if expecting to see someone watching the hotel. "The Portuguese government, they are most concerned about the activities of foreign nationals in Lisbon. I have been asked to observe certain guests and report anything unusual." "You are, in effect, a government informant," Poirot stated matter-of-factly. "I prefer to think of myself as a patriot protecting Portugal's neutrality," Rodriguez replied stiffly. "But yes, I have been watching Weber and Crawford and several others. Weber has been receiving coded telegrams through a contact at the German consulate. Crawford was clearly intelligence, though I was not certain for which side until Miss Hartwell enlightened me today. And Elena Vasquez, Senora Vasquez." Rodriguez's expression grew troubled. She is perhaps the most complex of all. She provides entertainment for diplomats and businessmen from various countries, but I suspect she also provides other services. A commotion in the corridor interrupted our conversation. Through our door, we could hear Weber's voice raised, in apparent distress, and Miss Hartwell's measured tones trying to calm him. Poirot opened the door slightly, and we could see Weber standing outside his room, gesticulating wildly. "It is gone," he was saying in his heavily accented English. "My suitcase, someone has taken it. And my papers, all my important documents." Miss Hartwell stood beside him, her face pale but composed. "Perhaps you should check with Captain Rodriguez about hotel security." But Rodriguez was already moving past us into the corridor. "What is missing, Senor Weber?" "Everything. My travel permits, my business papers." My Weber stopped abruptly, his face reddening. "My personal effects." Poirot emerged from our room with that air of helpful concern he wore so well. "Perhaps, monsieur, you could describe exactly what has been taken. Sometimes when one is upset, items are simply misplaced." Weber's room, when we entered it, showed clear signs of hasty packing. Clothes were scattered across the bed, drawers hung open, and papers littered the floor. But it was what was not there that proved most interesting. A small safe in the wardrobe stood open and empty, and the absence of any official documentation was conspicuous. "Most curious," Poirot murmured, examining the safe. "No signs of forced entry. The thief must have known the combination." Weber's face had gone quite white. "That is impossible." Only I knew he stopped himself, but the implication was clear. We returned to the nightclub to find Elena Vasquez in her dressing room, removing her stage makeup with shaking hands. When she saw us in the mirror, her composure finally cracked entirely. "I cannot continue with this charade," she said, turning to face us with tears streaming down her cheeks. "James Senna Crawford, he was trying to help me. I have been so foolish, so desperate." The story that emerged was both pitiful and damning. Alina had indeed been passing information between various parties' German contacts, who paid well for details about British diplomatic activities, British officials who wanted intelligence about German shipping schedules. She claimed she had begun the work simply to survive, but had become trapped between competing loyalties. "James discovered what I was doing," she sobbed. "But instead of exposing me, he offered to help me escape. He said he could arrange safe passage to Brazil away from all of this madness. We were to meet tomorrow morning. He was going to give me new papers, new identity." "And Weber?" Poirot asked gently. "Friedrich, he suspected that James was intelligence. He threatened to expose both of us unless I continued to provide information. But James, he was cleverer. He was going to turn the tables, to make Friedrich believe I was working only for the Germans, while I escaped entirely." The pieces seemed to be falling into place with suspicious neatness. Weber, discovered and desperate, had poisoned Crawford. To prevent his exposure, the stolen suitcase contained evidence of Weber's German connections. Alina was merely a pawn caught between opposing forces. Yet as we returned to the hotel in the small hours of the morning, I noticed that Poirot remained unusually quiet. His characteristic satisfaction at solving a puzzle was notably absent. Instead, he wore the expression of a man who had found a solution too convenient to be entirely trustworthy. In the lobby, we learned that Weber had indeed departed on the night train to Madrid, leaving behind an unpaid hotel bill and a roomful of scattered papers. Miss Hartwell had retired early, claiming exhaustion from the day's revelations. The hotel had settled into the peculiar quiet that comes in the hours before dawn, when even the most restless souls seek temporary peace. Standing at our window as the first pale light of morning began to touch the Lisbon rooftops, I felt that we had reached the end of our investigation. Crawford's killer had fled, his motives were clear, and the surviving participants in the spy drama would presumably scatter to the winds. Yet Poirot's silence suggested that our work was far from finished, and that the apparent solution concealed mysteries yet to be unraveled. Chapter 6. The double-cross. The news reached us at breakfast, delivered by a grim-faced Portuguese police inspector who spoke careful English, with the precision of a man translating each word in his mind before speaking it aloud. Friedrich Weber had been found in the early hours of the morning floating face down in the Tagus River near the Thais du Sadri. "A most tragic end to your investigation, I fear," Inspector Silva said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from us in the hotel dining room. The gentleman appears to have taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. Poirot's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Raymond, and what leads you to this conclusion? Inspector Silver produced a damp envelope from his coat pocket. We found this in his Jaquita confession of sorts. He admits to poisoning your Senna Crawford, and expresses his do you say, remorse for betraying German operations in Portugal. I examined the waterlogged note with considerable interest. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, quite different from the precise script we had observed in Weber's hotel registration. The message was brief and to the point. I cannot live with what I have done. Crawford discovered my work for the Reich. I had no choice but to silence him. May God forgive me. Weber, most convenient, Poirot murmured, his green eyes studying the paper with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. Tell me, Inspector, at what time was the body discovered? Shortly after 5 this morning. A fisherman preparing his nets found the body caught against the pier supports, and the condition of the corpse. Silver's expression grew uncomfortable. The gentleman had been in the water for some time, perhaps 6 or 7 hours. There was considerable deterioration. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And yet this note had survived remarkably well for having spent so long in the river. Paper of good quality, Silver replied, though his tone suggested he had not previously considered this point. German manufacturer, very durable. After the inspector's departure, Poirot spread the confession note on our table beside samples of Weber's handwriting from the hotel register. Even to my untrained eye, the differences were apparent. The confession showed signs of stress and haste, certainly, but there were more fundamental discrepancies. Observe, Mon cher Hastings, Poirot said, pointing to specific letters with his silver pen. Weber writes his R's with a distinctive flourish here in his signature, but in the confession, the R's are formed quite differently. And notice, the spacing Weber's normal hand shows careful Germanic precision. This note suggests someone writing rapidly while attempting to disguise their natural style. You think it's forged? I think, mon ami, that someone wishes us to believe Weber's guilt most earnestly. But why go to such elaborate lengths if the man was indeed guilty? Our contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Hartwell, who appeared considerably more composed than she had the previous evening. She carried herself with the sort of professional bearing I associated with military personnel, and I noticed that her grey hair had been arranged more severely, lending her face a harder, more authoritative cast. I've just heard about Weber, she said, without preamble. Most unfortunate, though I suppose it saves everyone a good deal of trouble. You seem remarkably sanguine about the death of a fellow human being, I observed. In my line of work, Captain Hastings, one learns to view such matters pragmatically. Weber was a German agent. His confession confirms what we suspected about James's death. Justice of a sort has been served. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. But there are certain inconsistencies that trouble me. For instance, the timeline. Weber left the hotel at approximately 10 last evening, yet the medical evidence suggests he entered the water no earlier than midnight. Where was he during those intervening hours? Miss Hartwell's composure flickered. Slightly, I suppose he was ... arranging his affairs, writing the confession, contemplating his actions. Peter. But there is another possibility, that someone else wrote the confession after Weber was already dead. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Rodriguez, accompanied by a man I had not previously encountered. The stranger was perhaps 40 years of age, with thinning sandy hair, and the sort of unremarkable features that would make him easily forgettable in a crowd. His clothes were well tailored but not ostentatious, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a professional. Monsieur Poirot, Rodriguez said, may I present Thomas Whitfield of the British Embassy? He has some information that may be relevant to your investigation. Whitfield extended his hand with a firm grip. I understand you've been looking into poor Crawford's death. Nasty business, though I'm relieved to hear his killer has been identified. You knew Crawford? Poirot inquired. Indeed, we worked together on several occasions. James was one of our most capable operatives in the Iberian Peninsula. Whitfield glanced meaningfully at Miss Hartwell. Though I confess I'm surprised too. Find Dorothy here. The last I heard, she was assigned to the Italian front. Miss Hartwell's face had gone quite pale. My assignment was changed, she said stiffly. Priorities shifted. Curious, Whitfield mused. I received no notification of additional personnel being assigned to the Lisbon station. In fact, My instructions were quite specific. James was to work alone on this particular operation. I felt the familiar tension that preceded one of Poirot's revelations. The little Belgian was watching both British agents with the sort of attention a cat might pay to two mice in the same cage. Perhaps Monsieur Poirot suggested to Whitfield, "You could enlighten us about the nature of this operation." James was investigating suspected leaks in our Portuguese network. Someone had been selling information to multiple parties: Germans, Spanish, even the Americans on occasion. His crossword code was meant to be a secure method of reporting his findings back to London. And what had he discovered? Whitfield's expression grew grim. That the leak came from within our own organizations, someone with access to our codes, our personnel files, our operational procedures. James's final communication indicated he had identified the traitor. Miss Hartwell had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange. "That's not James never mentioned working with anyone else. He told me he was operating independently." "Did he indeed?" Whitfield's tone was carefully neutral. How odd. James was always most conscientious about following proper protocols. He would never have worked with unauthorized personnel. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Either Miss Hartwell was lying about her assignment, or Whitfield was lying about Crawford's instructions. One of our supposed allies was not what they claimed to be. Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the busy street. "Below, most illuminating," he murmured. "It appears that our case is rather more complex than a simple matter of German espionage and remorse-driven suicide." I studied the torn telegram that Crawford had received on his final day, the fragments of which Poirot had painstakingly reconstructed. The message was brief, but clearly urgent. "Nightingale compromised. Stop abort. Mission stop. Trust nitrogen monoxide 1. Stop Nightingale." I said aloud. That must have been Crawford's code name. "Precisement," Poirot agreed. And this message, it was not an instruction from London. It was a warning from Crawford himself, meant for someone he trusted. But that someone never received it, because the telegram was intercepted and destroyed. The realization hit me with the force of a thunderbolt. Crawford had discovered the identity of the double agent, and had tried to warn his contact, but the warning had been intercepted, and Crawford had been silenced before he could expose the traitor. Whitfield and Miss Hartwell continued to eye each other with barely concealed suspicion, each clearly wondering what the other might know or suspect. The atmosphere in the room had grown heavy with unspoken accusations and carefully guarded secrets. As the morning progressed and we learned more details about Weber's death, the inconsistencies multiplied. Weber's behavior the previous evening had been suspicious, certainly, but it was the behavior of a man fleeing danger, not embracing it. His disappearance from the hotel had been hurried, but not desperate, suggesting he believed he still had options available to him. The forged confession, the convenient timing of his death, and the conflicting stories from our two British agents all pointed to a more sinister conclusion. Weber had not killed himself from remorse. He had been murdered to prevent him from revealing what he knew about the real killer. Someone was using the chaos of wartime espionage to cover their tracks. And that someone was still among us, still dangerous, and still very much alive. Chapter 7. The final transmission. The afternoon found Poirot hunched over Crawford's final crossword puzzle with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. He had spread the newspaper across the writing desk in our suite, surrounded by sheets of paper covered with his meticulous notes and calculations. The puzzle itself appeared unremarkably a standard grid from the previous evening's He had learned never to underestimate the significance of anything that captured my friend's attention so completely. "The pattern, she is different," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "All of Crawford's previous coded messages, they follow the same system, every third marked letter in sequence. But this final puzzle," he paused, tapping his pen against his teeth in that characteristic gesture of deep thought. "What's different about it? Regard Hastings. Here in the corner, see how these particular squares have been filled with letters that do not belong to the puzzle solutions. They are correct answers, but they spell words that have nothing to do with the clues provided." I leaned over his shoulder to examine the grid more closely. Indeed, several answers appeared to have been deliberately altered where the clue called for Lisbon. Someone had written London, where neutral was required. Traitor had been substituted. Crawford was improvising. I realized. This wasn't a standard intelligence transmission. He was trying to send a completely different kind of message. Excitement. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with satisfaction. And when we decode it using his established pattern, he carefully transcribed the altered letters onto a fresh sheet. London agent, double GameStop selling. All sides, stop proof in Wellington Suite, stop trust. Only Nightingale, Estiopitha. Implications struck me like a physical blow. Crawford had discovered not just any double agent, but someone operating from London itself. Someone with access to the highest levels of British intelligence, who was playing all sides for profit. Good Lord, I breathed. He was trying to warn Nightingale, whoever that is. Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, mon ami, Poirot said, his voice carrying that note of quiet certainty that indicated his little grey cells had reached a definitive conclusion. Nightingale was not the intended recipient of the warning. Crawford had discovered that his trusted contact was the very person selling British secrets. A knock at our door interrupted this revelation. Thomas Whitfield entered with the sort of determined efficiency that suggested he had been rehearsing his approach. His earlier affable manner had been replaced by something altogether more businesslike and, I fancied, rather more threatening. Monsieur Poirot, he began without preamble, I've just received word from London regarding the Crawford matter. Given Webber's confession and subsequent suicide, the case is to be considered closed. No further investigation is required or desired. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Indeed, how remarkably prompt of London to reach such a conclusion. The matter involves sensitive intelligence operations, Whitfield continued, his tone growing firmer. Prolonged investigation could compromise ongoing missions and endanger personnel still in the field. Webber's guilt is established. Justice has been served in its own way, and the security breach has been sealed. And yet, Poirot said mildly, certain questions remain unanswered. For instance, how did Webber know Crawford's true identity? How did he gain access to Crawford's room to poison the nightcap? And why did someone feel it necessary to forge a confession after Webber's death? Whitfield's jaw tightened perceptibly. Those are details that may never be fully explained. In intelligence work, Monsieur Poirot, absolute certainty is often a luxury we cannot afford. Sometimes we must accept probable solutions rather than perfect ones. But I am a man who believes in perfection, monsieur, especially when that perfection might prevent future deaths. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Hartwell, who appeared even more strained than she had that morning. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of distress. Her hair was dishevelled. Her hands trembled slightly, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had slept little, if at all. Thomas, she said, acknowledging Whitfield with a curt nod, I trust you've explained the situation to Monsieur Poirot. I've explained London's position, Whitfield replied carefully, though our Belgian friend seems disinclined to accept it. Miss Hartwell turned to Poirot with an expression that mingled desperation with determination. You must understand James's death, Webber's suicide. They're tragic, but they're finished. Continuing to investigate will only cause more harm. To whom, mademoiselle? To everyone involved. To the intelligence networks that keep people like you and Captain Hastings safe. To the operations that might prevent invasion, occupation, mass murder. Her voice rose slightly. Sometimes individual justice must be sacrificed for the greater good. Poirot had been listening to this exchange with that peculiar stillness that indicated his complete attention. Now he rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing down at the street where the late afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. Tell me, he said, without turning around, this greater good, does it include allowing a double agent to continue selling Allied secrets to the highest bidder? Does it include permitting a murderer to escape justice simply because that murderer wears a British uniform? The silence that followed was electric with tension. Both Whitfield and Miss Hartwell had gone very still like prey animals, suddenly aware of a predator's presence. That's a serious accusation, Whitfield said finally. But it is not an accusation. Monsieur Poirot turned to face them both, and I was struck by the cold certainty in his green eyes. It is a statement of fact. Crawford discovered the identity of the traitor in your organization. He attempted to send a warning, but that warning was intercepted. He was murdered to prevent him from exposing the truth. And Webber was killed too. Provide a convenient scapegoat. He turned back to face Miss Hartwell directly. Tell me, Mademoiselle, when exactly did you realize that Crawford had discovered your activities? The effect of his words was immediate and devastating. Miss Hartwell's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under pressure. Her face went deathly white, and her hands began to tremble visibly. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "But I think you do. Crawford's telegram, the one you delivered to his room, was not from London at all. It was from Crawford himself, sent to test his suspicions about you. When you delivered it personally rather than leaving it at the desk, when you asked those careful questions about his reaction, you confirmed his worst fears." Poirot's voice grew gentler, almost compassionate. "You have been selling intelligence for months, perhaps years, not from ideology, but from desperation, financial difficulties, family obligations. Something drove you to betray your country for money. Crawford discovered the pattern in compromised operations, traced it back to its source, and realized that his trusted contact was the very person he had been assigned to identify." Miss Hartwell's composure finally collapsed entirely. "You don't understand," she whispered. "My mother, the medical bullseye, never meant for anyone to die. It was just information, just papers and schedules that seemed unimportant, but they were important, weren't they? Important enough that people died because of what you sold. And when Crawford threatened to expose you, you made a choice: his life or your secret. The digitalis was meant to appear natural," she said, her voice barely audible. "Heart failure in a man under stress, no one would question it. But then you arrived, started asking questions, so you improvised. You convinced Weber that his own identity was compromised, that he needed to flee immediately. When he panicked and tried to leave the country, he followed him, killed him, and staged his suicide with that forged confession." Inspector Silva had been taking rapid notes throughout this revelation. "The evidence, Monsieur Poirot, can you prove these accusations? The evidence lies in the details that only the killer could know," Poirot replied. Miss Hartwell knew Crawford's room habits, his bedtime routine. She had access to his quarters in her role as hotel staff. She knew about the crossword code because Crawford trusted her with intelligence protocols. And most damning of all, she knew that "Goodnight" was Crawford's code phrase for mission compromised. He turned back to Miss Hartwell, who sat hunched in her chair like a broken doll. When Crawford said just "Goodnight" to the porter, he was sending a final message, not to London, but to anyone who might investigate his death. He was telling them that his mission had been compromised, that his cover was blown. It was his last act of defiance against the person who had betrayed him. The rain continued to beat against the windows as Inspector Silva quietly placed Miss Hartwell under arrest. She offered no resistance, seeming almost relieved that her charade was finally over. As she was led away, she turned back once to address the room. "James was a good man," she said quietly. "I never wanted him to suffer. I just... I couldn't see any other way out." After her departure, the remaining group sat in stunned silence. Elena wept quietly for the man who had tried to help her escape the spy games that had trapped them all. Whitfield stared out at the rain-soaked street, perhaps contemplating how close he had come to closing the case with an innocent man's false confession. Captain Rodriguez methodically collected the evidence, his professional demeanor barely concealing his shock at the revelation. As for Poirot, he stood at the window, gazing out at the lights of Lisbon, that great stage where players from across Europe had acted out their small dramas. In the morning, some would continue their performances, while others would find their roles forever changed by the events in room 347 of the Hotel Tivoli. The war would continue, secrets would still be bought and sold, and the great game of nations would play on. But in one small corner of that vast conflict, justice had been served on. A good man's final message had been heard and understood. Sometimes, in the chaos of wartime, that was the most one could hope for. The truth would eventually surface, like letters rising from a crossword puzzle, spelling out words that mattered to those who knew how to read them. Thanks for joining us for Goodnight, Mr. Coffin. If you enjoyed this wartime adventure with Hercule Poirot, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, this is Alie signing off from Café Tales.